Okay, well, as everyone who's been following It's the Gun Stupid knows, we typically start off the show with Martha Rosenberg, our senior editor, and myself talking about some striking gun news that has come up in the last week or a couple of weeks. So, Martha, good morning. How are you?
Well, I'm well, thank you. Elliot, how are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Working on a little cold, but hopefully I don't sound too nasal for our listeners. Well, listen, let's get right into it. There was an amazingly positive decision that came out of the Supreme Court, of all places, on the behalf of our side for a change. And the Supreme Court ruled on Monday, June 16th, that straw purchasing, and for our listeners who aren't quite familiar with the term, straw purchasing is when someone purchases a gun, someone who legally can purchase a gun, purchases it for someone who could not legally purchase the gun. The most striking example, in fact, the first time I ever heard the term was at the Columbine shooting, where the two killers were underage and could not get guns. And they had a fellow, a friend, a classmate or a friend, or a woman, I think, uh, who was over 18, go and purchase the guns for them. And of course,
And
that
there,
led
and
to the Columbine horror. Yes, Martha?
and there were. I was going to say there's two other well-known violent events that rested on straw purchasing. One was on Christmas Eve. There was a man in upstate New York who shot a lot of firefighters. He
Oh,
had
yeah.
received his gun from a straw purchaser who walked right into a Gander Mountain and bought it and gave it to him, and he had just got out of prison. And then more recently, the Boston Marathon criminal or suspect had also received, his gun was also bought by a straw purchaser, and that was from Cabela's.
Wow. Wow.
So
And the
it's a
straw
real theme.
purchaser uh, had nothing happen to them. And that's what the Supreme Court has now ruled. There was a lower court case, Abramsky versus the United States, uh, and it's now ruled that if you do purchase a gun for someone else, uh, that's a straw purchase, and you will be liable, to the penalties. I guess the states now will have to decide what the penalties are. Uh, but it is a federal crime. Here's what the says that the court makes it a federal crime for one lawful gun owner to buy a gun for another, whether they're buying it for a lawful gun owner or a prohibited purchaser. That's the interesting thing. That straw purchases, people who do this purchasing are now breaking the law. So that's an amazing outcome. What's also amazing to me, when I read the article,
Right.
is, I mean, this seems so obvious, right? I mean, what could make more sense, than a law like this, to make straw purchasing illegal? Uh, that four of the justices, it was a 5-4 decision in favor of making straw purchasing illegal. How could any judge vote against it?
Well,
It,
well,
it?
you're
it
absolutely right,
boggles my
Elliot. And a
mind.
couple. Well, and the distinction, the reason that this was a ruling is because the four that opposed the ruling and the gun lobby who probably brought the case believed that if the straw buyer was legal and he was buying it for another legal person who just for one reason or another wasn't at Gander Mountain, that it was okay. And Scalia actually said in a very rude remark, according to the press, that if he sent his son to the store to get eggs and milk and gave him $10, would he be the buyer? Which is such derision toward the fact that it's a lethal weapon. And then Kagan retorted to that it's more analogous to sending your son to buy you an iPhone, and it's your iPhone, and you'll use it. But, that's sort of how the argument circulated.
Well, it's interesting who the cast of characters were that voted against making straw purchasing illegal when, number one, it's known for a fact. I mean, the law enforcement has known this for years, and we all have observed it and seen it, that straw purchasing leads, the reason the straw purchasing happens is that somebody wants to do something lethal with the gun. And, there's a wealth of, evidence and data showing that straw purchasing is one of the prime reasons for our gun violence epidemic. So that to have 4 Supreme Court justices vote against making straw purchasing illegal boggles my mind. And it's the usual cast of characters. It's, of course, Scalia and Clarence Thomas, the silent one, and then the Chief Justice John Roberts and Sam Alito, Justice Alito, the guys who, in my opinion, you've heard me say this, should have been brought up on charges of perjury because what they said during their hearings about not overturning established law and that they weren't those type of judges, they've turned out to be exactly those kind of judges. But that's for another show. If we ever do a political show, we'll talk about that.
Justice Kagan had said too, with regard to this, that if the records do not show the actual owner, even if the actual owner is legal, but he wasn't the purchaser because it was a straw purchaser, it makes all records moot and unusable. All records are that law enforcement doesn't have the use of any accurate records. It makes a mockery of the whole system.
Yes. And here's Scalia, it's funny that what I'm reading here is that Scalia, who wrote the opinion for the minority, says whether or not this is a sensible result, the statutes Congress enacted do not support it. So when the statutes the Congress wrote is something that he wants, then they override the statutes, right. Like the campaign finance stuff, Citizens United and so many other things they've passed. But here they, kind of get up on their soapbox and say, well, the Congress acted it, so we, enacted it, so we can't overturn it. All right. Enough for that story. Thank goodness that it's been passed, and maybe that, is going to be it is a very important step, and maybe it's going to lead to other sensible, sane things happening. That's an example of what we would call a sane gun law.
Well, actually, Elliot, there is one more aspect to the Supreme Court ruling. Back in March, before we had this radio show, there was a unanimous Supreme Court ruling, which the 4 holdouts on this one went with the more progressives, and the ruling said that if a domestically violent person simply kicks or hits or in some way abuses a person without a lethal weapon, they are still a prohibited purchaser, and they all agree with that. And some people are saying that maybe the courts are coming around to our side.
Well, I certainly hope so, and we will see. We will see. All we can do is to keep trying, and hopefully we can get it done. So the next thing is an amazing piece of information. I don't know if our viewers are aware of the fact that the in 1996, at the with the National Rifle Association pushing it, the Congress effectively stopped federally financed research on gun violence. In other words, while the CDC and the National Institute of Health normally do research on things that affect the public safety, uh, the NRA had that research blocked because they were able to get the funding to do the research blocked. So after Newtown, President Obama called for an end to the ban and asked Congress to provide $10 million to the Center for Disease Control to study gun violence. And he put it in his recent budget proposal. So here's the here's what happened. Representative Jack Kingston, a Republican of Georgia and a leader of the House subcommittee that sets the CDC budget, told ProPublica, which is a news organization, that, quote, the president's request to fund propaganda for his gun-grabbing initiatives through the CDC will not be included in the fiscal year 2015 appropriations bill, close quote. I don't know how you respond to that you call research propaganda. I mean, this is like going back to medieval times. What do you say to this?
It is. No, it's absolutely shocking to think that a gun lobby could be bigger than our own government. And there's a quote that went along with this. No, I'm sorry about that quote. But no, it's a shock that this funding can't happen. According to the New York Times, who did an editorial this week on this, right now gun violence is viewed through the lens of law enforcement and mental health. And yet it is a public health problem like tobacco and drunk driving, says the New York Times, and yet it can't be addressed as a public health problem through CDC because of this funding embargo.
It's astonishing. It's astonishing. And before the embargo took place, there was some research done that showed, for example, that having a gun at home to protect yourself from an intruder, that gun was 22 times more likely to be used to kill or shoot someone in the home.
Well, exactly. And another thing...
So it's that kind of research that would allow us to set sane gun laws that is barred. And as you say, it's outrageous, and it's something that we're going to get changed because of our economic levers. And in particular, later in the show, we're going to talk about our Hallmark boycott and our move to get corporate America off the sidelines. Because with corporate America off the sidelines, Kingston won't be making this kind of statement anymore.
And Elliot, there's another aspect to the research, if I could quickly say, that many times we'll hear a news article about mass shooting averted or prevented because they got the law enforcement were on their toes. And the New York Times says that if we could study mass shootings that were prevented, there would be a lot of information on that. And right now the gun lobby pretends like, well, these things happen and they can't be prevented, which of course is a bald-faced lie. It also implies that they didn't arm all the nation, but the idea of prevent, that there have been very excellent examples of school shootings in particular that have been averted.
And averted with people without guns, by the way. There was the high school football coach who scared away the shooter. in the high school, and
Right.
even the Gabby Gifford situation. The person was tackled. The killer was tackled as they were trying to reload. There are many instances of that. Well, okay. Martha, as always, I enjoy talking to you, with you about the news.
Thank
Uh,
you.
I think we could do a full 2 hours on each week's news, but that's all we have time for now. So I'll see you a little later in the show when we talk about the Hallmark boycott.
Thank you, Elliot. Nice to talk to you.
Today might be the day I drop out of school. Today could be the last day I try. My parents alone can't stop me. My friends can't even stop me. But you might be able to. With United Way, you could tutor me, be my mentor, or volunteer to just read with me. If someone had helped me earlier, I might not be struggling. And studies prove that kids who read well by 3rd grade are more likely to graduate. There are tons of ways people like you can help kids like me stay in school. And United Way is calling for you to be one of them. Because it takes 12 years to create a graduate. It takes about the same time to create a dropout. And the difference between me becoming one or the other could be you. Make me a success, not a statistic.
Take the pledge to volunteer now at unitedway.org. Brought to you by United Way and the Ad Council.
Hello, this is Julia Louis-Dreyfus, and I want to tell you about my new favorite discovery, Yosemite National Park. I recently went there with my husband and children, and we walked the trails to see the breathtaking waterfalls, admired the grand meadows and giant sequoias. But the future of our national parks is uncertain. Many challenges face our parks today, from polluted air and water to development threats outside their borders and inadequate funding to protect our national heritage. That's why the National Parks Conservation Association recently completed a decade-long assessment of the challenges facing our national parks, along with proposed actions that will ensure our children and grandchildren will be able to enjoy the parks as we have. Our national parks have inspired Americans for nearly 100 years. As we approach the centennial of the National Park Service in 2016, please join us in helping to protect our national park legacy. Find out how at www.mpca.org.
Well, welcome back. I can't tell you how pleased I am and excited to be speaking to our next guest, Robin Thomas. Robin is the executive director of the Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence, which, in my view, is one of the strongest and finest organizations working to help us get sane gun laws in the land. They have a brilliant website. If you ever want to get a fact or information about anything, go to smartguns.org and smartgunlaws.org, and you'll find whatever you need. They're a spectacular place. And Robin oversees the Law Center's legal activities. She's an expert on the Second Amendment. She's been involved as an expert in many panel discussions, and of course has been on media, TV, radio, many years. Robin, good afternoon. How are you?
I'm good, Elliot. Thanks for having me.
Oh, so glad that you're here. I think it'd be interesting for our listeners to hear how the Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence came into existence.
Well, when we first started, it was 1993, and on July 1st of 1993, a disgruntled client went to a law firm in downtown San Francisco at 101 California Street. He had driven to Nevada and acquired some assault weapons that were already illegal in California, and he took those assault weapons up to the law firm's offices and shot 13 people. And so, sorry, he shot 16 people, and including himself. And in the days and weeks following the tragedy, the legal community in San Francisco really stepped up and decided that they needed to make something positive come out of this tragic event. And so they launched what at the time was called LCAV, the Legal Community Against Violence, and now the name has been changed to the Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence. And it's 20 years later, and not only have we grown exponentially in terms of our size and our work, but we're proud to say that many of the same people that started the organization 20 years ago and were committed from then are still committed now and either sit on our board or are strong supporters. So it's really a legacy of doing this doing this work in honor of those lost and to prevent similar future tragedies if possible.
Well, I know how much the people who were lost are held in everyone's memory. I had the pleasure of attending your 20-year gala last year, and on the program, it notes who the fallen lawyers were, and I think that's wonderful that 20 years later their names are still public, still there. Speaking about 20 years, I have a question I was going to ask you, and that is, what it has a couple of parts to it, but what would you say are the biggest changes in this battle for sane gun laws that you've seen? I know you've been there for about 8 or 9 years, but what have you seen that you would identify as the biggest changes in this fight?
I think a lot really shifted after Newtown. We had been making very incremental progress in a lot of states, and particularly in California, where we've had the opportunity to really implement a comprehensive regime of gun regulation and to see that become successful not only in terms of preventing gun violence, but creating a model that can be used by other states. But it wasn't until the shooting at Sandy Hook, I think that something about that tragedy, the people who were lost there, the scope of it, the sort of the way it resonated in this country was very different from previous shootings. I mean, we thought maybe after Tucson or after Aurora or Virginia Tech that this country would have reached a tipping point on gun violence and we'd see change, but that didn't happen, and it didn't really happen until Newtown. I would say in a normal year, probably work with 5 or 6 or 7 states helping to draft gun regulations and testify in support of them. And in the days and weeks following Newtown, we were contacted by 30 states and had the privilege to see 21 states pass significant gun regulations. And that truly was a sea change in terms of interest and shift at the state level. I mean, several of those states, New York and Connecticut, Maryland and Delaware, passed sweeping, comprehensive gun reform. New York and Connecticut brought together a package of laws that approximates California's level of gun regulation, and that was a huge, huge change. Even states like Colorado, which traditionally had been very, very difficult to get anything through, passed really significant regulation. So, certainly our work tracking all of the state regulation and working with states across the country, we saw things change a lot after Newtown. Not just that, but having Gabby Giffords really step up onto this issue and create her organization and get out front talking about the issue, having the Moms Demand Action be created, and seeing a vehicle where moms can get engaged and feel connected to this issue in a way that really is effective, were huge changes. These are having a grassroots network like the one the moms have created and Gabby Giffords have created, having the kind of money that Gabby Giffords and Michael Bloomberg are now putting into this issue. These are the kind of changes that we've needed and are now finally happening.
Well, there's no question that Newtown was a turning point for sure. I call Newtown the secondhand moment, the secondhand smoke moment of the gun issue. Uh, and what I mean by that is that when the very first report on smoking came out, that the tobacco companies had known for years that smoking causes cancer and had hidden that information. When that report came out, people were outraged. It hit two types of viewers: the smokers and the non-smokers. So for the smokers, it was how could the non-smokers? It was how could any industry do such a thing? It was real moral outrage. And for the smokers, it was, well, I better stop smoking and get my kids not to smoke. But nothing changed. Nothing really changed. When the next report came out, that secondhand smoke was essentially equivalent to smoking. If you were sitting in a theater or a restaurant and smoke was filling the air, it was as though you were smoking. Now it affected everybody. And the moment it affected everybody, that's when everything changed. And we've come to where we've come to now, where when you see someone smoking, you kind of question their mental clarity. I think everyone has kids, grandkids. They know people, with children if they don't. And I think now everyone understands on some level since Newtown that this does affect me personally. And that's always the key for change when people understand or believe that that affects them personally. So, yeah, very, very good things. You mentioned California laws, and I know that you put out a piece earlier in the year about laws, gun laws really do work.
Yes.
And maybe that would be a nice thing for you to review with our audience as to some evidence, because there's always the other side saying, no, we can't have any gun laws, they don't work.
I think looking specifically at California, over the last 20 years, we've been able to see a really broad range of gun regulations implemented, everything from bans on assault weapons and large-capacity ammunition sales, obviously universal background checks, bans on junk guns and 50-caliber sniper rifles, regulation of, having record-keeping of gun sales, which has enabled law enforcement in California to have a system by which they can go and retrieve guns from people who become prohibited. So once somebody commits a felony or a domestic violence misdemeanor, law enforcement now is able to cross-check that list with a list of people who've purchased guns and go and retrieve guns from them. There's about 20,000 people that were on that list when California DOJ started doing that work last year. So it's, those kinds of laws really have had a tremendous impact in California, where now gun violence has dropped by 56% in the last 20 years. And that's a lot of people's lives saved. It used to be close to 5,000 people a year were killed in California by gun violence, and now that number is less than 3,000. And while it's still far too high and too many people lost, that's 2,000 people a year whose lives are being saved, and families that are not being forced to contend with this tragic issue. And that's really, really significant. If you look more broadly at the country, what you see is that in the states where you have really strong gun regulation, whether it's California, New York, Hawaii, you see much, much lower gun death rates than in states where there is very lax gun regulation. And so there's a way to look and see how gun regulation, sort of over the arch of the whole country, seems to be having an impact on the level of gun violence. California has the 9th lowest gun death rate in the country. And you have to take into account that California is dealing with serious urban violence problems in places like, San Francisco and Oakland, Los Angeles, Richmond. Even contending with, the multi-factored issues that confront urban gun violence, we've still been able to be the 9th lowest. And you compare that with states like, Wyoming, where you don't have these sort of dense urban issues, and yet you have much higher gun death rates by population than you do in California. And that really, to me, says something about, high gun ownership rates and low rates, low impact of gun regulation, and how that correlates to more people dying, or, conversely in California, being able to save a tremendous number of lives. So gun laws absolutely do work. There's a large number of studies that look at some of the impact of specific laws, whether it's lost and stolen reporting laws and one gun a month laws, which have a really positive impact on trafficking patterns. And the Mayors Against Illegal Guns, now every town, has produced some really great studies on trafficking and the kinds of laws that decrease trafficking. I was just at an event yesterday talking about domestic violence issues. There's a lot of laws showing, a lot of studies showing how certain regulations have a really positive impact on reducing domestic violence problems. Even just universal background check laws do have a tremendously positive impact on the numbers when it comes to how many women are being subjected to domestic violence. So, these laws absolutely do work. Are they as effective as they could be? Probably not, because we have porous state borders, and if you can't get an illegal gun in California, you can drive to Nevada or New Mexico or Arizona and buy illegal guns much more easily there and traffic them into California. The same thing happens a lot in cities like Chicago and on the East Coast in New York. The illegal guns are not coming from those cities. They're coming from outside of the city, whether it's from other parts of the state or just from other states nearby with really lax gun laws. And so it makes it really challenging when you live in a city like New York or Chicago and you pass, really positive gun regulations, and these guns are flowing in from elsewhere.
No question about it. No question about it. As you know, I live in Chicago, though by way of New York originally. So I'm a city kid through and through. But when I speak, I always am challenged about the fact that Chicago has some of the toughest gun laws in the country, and yet some of the highest violence, gun violence. And my response always is Chicago doesn't have any gun laws because the trafficking nullifies the ones they have. There is probably as much guns on the street as there'd be if Chicago had the same laws as Wyoming does. And the trafficking is an incredibly difficult issue. And we had a piece of wonderful news this past week, about 2 weeks ago, where the Supreme Court has now upheld that straw purchasing, one of the key elements of trafficking, is illegal. What was your take on that ruling?
It's interesting. When you look at the Supreme Court and what the Supreme Court has done over the last, say, 10 years, it's actually a very interesting story, because the Supreme Court hadn't looked at the Second Amendment in about 70 years. The last decision had been in 1939 in a case called Miller, where they had held that the Second Amendment was related to militia control. And obviously, that's very different from what the Supreme Court said in 2008 in the Heller case, which is that you do have an individual right to own a gun in your home for self-defense. And that, to me, was an overruling of the precedent, but they didn't frame it that way, unfortunately. But regardless, the Supreme Court made this decision that you now do have this individual right. And when you look at constitutional law, when you call something an individual right, a civil right, it changes the dynamic. It changes the way that courts look at laws that fit into that category, and it changes our perception of those laws. And so after the Supreme Court's decision in 2008, the gun lobby and their large network of allies began filing lawsuits challenging gun regulations across the country, testing the boundaries of this Supreme Court decision and how it would be applied in other, to other types of regulation than just the pure gun bans that were in place in Washington, D.C., and then later the one challenged in the McDonald case in Chicago. And so the NRA and all of those gun lobby folks started started filing lawsuits challenging laws, everything from assault weapon bans and age restrictions and background check categories, you name it. We're tracking about 900 cases that have been filed since 2008 and the Heller case. And what's been interesting is that since those two decisions, in all of these courts where these types of laws have been challenged, have gone up to the circuit court level, which is the highest level below the Supreme Court at the federal level, in 96% of the cases, we have won. We have had courts upholding common sense gun regulations and saying that these regulations satisfy the scrutiny of courts in terms of having legitimate purposes and not going too far in infringing on rights in order to achieve that purpose of safety and protecting our communities. And that's been really interesting because to have 96% wins is a very different type of ball game than what we see in the legislative arena. And that impact, that response to the decision has been really exciting to see happen, because if you talk to gun lobby folks after the Heller case, they would have told you that this was going to make a huge difference in terms of the types of laws that can be passed. And that, in fact, has not really been the case. So it's been really interesting. Now, the Supreme Court has had more than 60 opportunities to take up other cases since 2010 in the McDonald decision, opportunities to expand their interpretation of the right protected by the Second Amendment to include either rights to carry guns in public or to restrict, age limitations, whatever aspect of gun regulation they would have liked to see the Second Amendment applied to include. They have actually chosen not to take up those cases. So they've rejected certiorari. They've rejected the opportunity to hear those cases and make decisions on them, which to those of us following the issue says that they are choosing to let stand these decisions in other courts which uphold gun regulation. And that's a very, very powerful message by the court. They have taken up a few really fringe cases, Abramski and Castleman being two that have come down this term, one which looks at, the one you referred to, which looks at the way in which somebody who makes a straw purchase can be prosecuted, so somebody who purchases a gun on behalf of someone else, whether they're eligible or ineligible to buy a gun, but who lies on the forms which state that you understand you're purchasing the gun for yourself. And then an earlier case, the Castleman case, which looked at a category of domestic violence prohibition, and one in which gun lobbyists were arguing that unless it fit a very particular category, a crime shouldn't be able to be defined as domestic violence and prohibit gun purchase. And in both of those cases, the court held that the prohibition on guns, whether it was somebody who committed a crime that should be defined as domestic violence, or the case you're referring to, where the court looked at the way in which a statute interpreting straw purchasing was applied, and in both cases said, no, these laws need to be upheld. They don't violate Second Amendment rights. Not that the Second Amendment was directly at issue in these cases. They had more to do with a definition of the law slightly outside of the Second Amendment, but which implicated gun acquisition. And in both cases, the court upheld these laws and found for our side. So, overall, I would say since these two sort of landmark decisions, the Supreme Court and almost all of the lower courts have continued to uphold reasonable gun regulations almost without exception.
Well, 96% is unheard of.
Yeah.
I mean, it really is an unheard of number. I don't know if I'm always curious as to, what happened with the 4%. And, were they in states that were particularly pro-gun, or in circuit courts that were known, to be extremely conservative? Was there anything that linked, or was common to those four decisions against, the 4% decisions against?
A few of them are just plain outliers, cases in a few southern states where, obviously any decision by a judge is, in large part, hopefully has some consistency with the law, but on occasion judges have strong personal feelings about an issue and they make outlier decisions. There's not a lot we can do about that other than challenge it up the chain and hope that a judge higher up will overturn it, but most of them are just outlier decisions. There's a few key ones that are not necessarily outliers that are a little bit troubling that we're watching very closely. One is a case in California called the Peruta case, which struck down a concealed carry permitting system in San Diego County as being too restrictive. And that case was decided by the Ninth Circuit, and hopefully it's going to be reheard en banc, meaning that not just a small panel of the Ninth Circuit, but a larger group of Ninth Circuit judges will review that decision to make sure that it's consistent with the overall preference of the Ninth Circuit. So it's not clear yet if that decision will stand or if an en banc panel will look at it and overturn it. But that was a disappointing outcome, and unfortunately we got a bad panel in terms of this issue of more conservative judges that overturned it. It was still a 2-1 decision, which is unusual on circuit courts to not have unanimous decisions. The other case is a case in the Seventh Circuit called Moore, and in the state of Illinois, there was a complete ban on both open carrying of weapons and concealed carry of weapons. And the Moore v. Madigan case challenged that regulation as going too far in terms of Second Amendment rights. And unfortunately, the Seventh Circuit did say that this particular combination of laws, this scheme in Illinois, was too far in terms of gun regulation, and found Illinois' laws around public carrying of weapons to be unconstitutional. Now, on the upside, the court did make reference to the fact that a relatively strict version of concealed carry permitting, like that we have in New York and Maryland and California and a number of other states, would likely work fine. But unfortunately, you then need to get these laws through the legislature, and that's a different ballgame. And so, unfortunately, the Moore decision, which struck down those laws, led to the passage of some relatively permissive concealed carry permitting in Illinois. So there are definitely a few decisions we've been disappointed about, and which have created an unpleasant, slightly unpleasant situation in terms of having to deal with how to respond to these decisions. But there's very, very few of those. I can more or less name on one hand the decisions that have been problematic that way, and otherwise we're seeing pretty much universally the courts upholding these laws.
Well, that's really interesting to hear your comments about those outliers, but the ones that weren't exactly outliers. I live in Chicago, so obviously I'm affected personally by the conceal and carry. And I wrote an op-ed piece about Judge Posner, who wrote the opinion for the majority on the circuit court that ordered Chicago to allow open carry. And his argument, or at least the one that was cited most in the media, was that law-abiding citizens have a right to carry guns to provide self-defense. And that's one of the things that when I hear really roils me, because there's only two things wrong with that statement. One, what is a law-abiding citizen? The gun side, the NRA and the gun side would have you believe that that's a constant. That person is a constant and will never change. And when I ask them what is a law-abiding citizen, or the so-called good guy, what's the good guy stopping the bad guy with the gun? Define the good guy? They always say, well, it's somebody who always does the right thing. And I say, but there's no such creature that always does the right thing. In fact, to not even be argumentative, you can just logically understand that every criminal was once a law-abiding citizen. So to say we should put our trust in, quote, law-abiding citizens is something that is very problematical for me. The other side of it is that carrying a gun in public does not provide self-defense. If it did, no police officers would ever get killed. Right. And it's the element of surprise that always overcomes the gun carrier. And we currently have issued a a $50,000 challenge to the Illinois State Rifle Association to stop arguing. Let's not argue. We say it doesn't provide defense. You say it does. Let's do a test and find out. And they don't want to go anywhere near that test because they know that what we're saying is right. It doesn't provide self-defense. So we've taken it further, and we will get that test done this year. We're probably going to do it with an organization called The Truth About Guns, where they've had their members or their followers chip in the 50 grand, and now we just have to find a place to do it. But to hear the judge cite something as the reason for his voting, in favor of it was really disturbing. And I'm wondering what's going to happen when we prove that carrying a gun doesn't provide self-defense. If we can go back and visit some of these laws, what would your thought be about that, Robin?
I think there's already been some really interesting studies looking at, sort of this idea of, I don't want to say a good guy with a gun, but the ability to use guns to either defend yourself or others in times and places of high stress. I think it was 2020 or CBS did a test a few years back where they taught a bunch of students how to shoot guns and armed them with sort of, paint guns and put them in a classroom and told them that there was going to be a shooting in the classroom and to sort of be ready. And then sometime in the middle of class, they sent in an armed shooter, and they recorded what happened and then looked back at it. And when they looked back at what had happened, not only did not one armed student in the entire classroom manage to shoot the shooter before he shot most of the people in the classroom, but many of them shot each other and themselves. And it was such an interesting study because these are people who were prepared, who were trained, who were prepared and knew that this was coming, and still it by no means enabled them to protect themselves. So the whole idea that under stress and in those situations that an armed citizen is going to somehow stop crime or is going to protect a group from a mass shooter is actually absolutely a fallacy. There's another story of when the shooting in the Tucson parking lot happened, that there was a concealed carry individual in the supermarket who ran out when he heard the gunshots and pulled out his gun, and he says he almost shot the wrong person, that he was about to shoot the person who had tackled the shooter to the ground, the hero who had stopped him, and he didn't know who was who, and he almost shot the wrong person. So these stories, these are obviously anecdotes and individual instances, but I certainly think this idea that someone with a gun in a public place is somehow going to solve everything is sort of absurd. And beyond that, we know for sure that having more guns in public places, whether it's bars or restaurants or on the street, creates a much higher risk of conflicts turning deadly and of people getting hurt. You just look at the fact, as I said earlier, of these states that have very, very lax gun laws, including concealed carry systems, and they have much higher rates of gun death. So having more guns on the street isn't saving people's lives and preventing violence. It's creating more violence by having more guns more easily available, and the lethality of those weapons is sure to lead to some serious impact.
Well, I'm familiar with the Diane Sawyer test, and what happened afterwards. It was so clear that even carrying the gun and being told, knowing in advance that it was going to happen, even that did not carry the day for the gun carriers. And the NRA and the pro-gunners claimed for some reason that the test wasn't fair.
I'm sure they did. I'm sure they did.
We're going to try to do our test at a facility, at a police training academy. There are 7 of them certified in Illinois for police training. And we want to get several types of conceal and carriers go through. We want to get people who have had no training, because many states allow you to conceal and carry without training.
Right.
The big deal is if you get 16 hours of training in Illinois, which is supposed to be a big deal. Well, let's see how these people do. And then we want to get the real, aficionados, the people who claim they go to the gun range every day and, can deal with anything. Let's see how they do. That's what our bet's about. Let's see if you can defend yourself. Maybe you can. Maybe we're wrong.
Well,
Maybe I should
doubt
be
it, but
carrying
it's
a gun,
possible.
but I don't think so. So I think if we definitively prove this, I'm just wondering, and I met with one of the legislators that I'm close to in the Illinois State Assembly this week, and talked about that very thing. If we come back with proof that nobody can say this isn't fair, because we're going to design the tests with, as I said, an organization called The Truth About Guns. Their leader, their executive director, has been on our show twice, and he insists that they can defend themselves, and I, of course, insist you can't. So if we definitively prove this, where nobody can say it wasn't fair, could we think that we could go back and revisit some of the gun laws that are based on something wrong? If something's wrong and you've based a law on it, don't we have a chance to go back and say, okay, we had wrong information, now we have to revisit this? What do you think about that as a possibility?
I mean, I think any time you're able to produce hard evidence, it's helpful, particularly because courts, when they are analyzing and reviewing existing regulation, the more evidence and facts they have at their disposal to enable them to talk about, what courts are doing is they're balancing the restriction, the burden that a law places against the impact and the effect of it. And so if you can show definitively that a particular law, doesn't make you safer, or conversely does make you safer, then you're giving courts an incredibly valuable tool to utilize when they're looking at whether a regulation should be upheld. And so, work like that is tremendously useful as, courts need more and more data in order to uphold laws. And I think it would be helpful for that. Now, as far as how will it impact new legislation or existing legislation, I mean, that's trickier, because part of what we're faced with on this issue are large groups of legislators who have been for many, many years under the thumb of the NRA. They've been getting money from the NRA. They've been having meetings, and they've gotten close with NRA lobbyists and the NRA's allies. And so getting legislators to see that there's a cost on both sides, and that the types of decisions and legislation that is passed impacts not just the gun lobby that are out there, kind of making their case, but that there's a lot of other people who are paying attention and understand the impact of those laws. I mean, that's kind of a different question, because passing legislation isn't, unfortunately, just about what's true and what works. It's also about, where legislators see the cost of how they vote. So I think it has to come along with, a sense of the opportunity to make sure they know people are paying attention to these decisions and know the implications. So it's sort of complicated. I mean, unfortunately, what I've learned is that doing the right thing when it comes to gun regulation isn't always about the truth. A lot of it's about the politics and, who has the loudest voice in any particular political space. So, I do think that it helps. It will help. It's always, always useful to have the facts on your side in any situation, which I know that we already do. But, whether or not that will translate on the legislative side is a slightly different question.
Well, there's no question that the history you recount of the legislators being under the thumb of the NRA is a fact.
Yes.
And our whole organization National Gun Victims Action Council, is based on that fact. And so our approach, and if you listen to the first part of the program or you listen later on, our approach is to use economic levers to force sane gun laws. We're done asking. If you go to our website, you'll see a big sign that says, "We're done asking." We asked for 22 years at the federal level, and response was no response. So, there's a lot of people we have to ask, and a lot of people in organizations such as the ones you mentioned earlier, the Gabby Giffords one, Moms, so many of them will continue asking, and we need to have them do that. But we're taking a different approach. We're adding an approach, I should say, and that is our economic lever approach, where we're going to punish states and large corporations and get them to get legislators to change their mind. I'll be talking about it later, though I talked about it in the first part. We've just called a boycott against Hallmark. And the ask is a lot different than the usual ask. Our ask is that Hallmark has to publicly come out for universal background checks and then advocate for them. And we're going to break them. And when we do, we're going to use that as a lever to get corporate America off the sidelines. I think one of the big mistakes our side's made is to let corporate America stay on the sidelines, and we're not going to do it. That's our focus. We're not going to do it anymore, just for the reasons you mentioned, that the legislators are under. The truth doesn't matter. Facts don't matter often. The legislators are under the thumb of the NRA. Well put. I have a question that's been in the back of my mind since your opening statement, Robin.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned that in California, you keep a database of everyone who purchases a gun. This, of course, is the dagger, the mythical dagger in the heart of all the gun owners. It's what the NRA has sold, that if the government knows who has a gun, they'll take it away. So as the law stands right now, you can't have a federal database.
Right.
But are you saying that you can have a state database, that wasn't challenged? Or was it challenged and defeated?
I'm actually not sure if it's been challenged. I don't believe that it has. And my understanding is that it's not so much, we don't have registration in California, but we do have records of gun sales that are kept centrally. So it's not so much that we have a list of gun owners somewhere, but it's more the case that we can search. Law enforcement can look at and search records of who's bought guns. So it's a slightly different, but my understanding is that it hasn't been, certainly to the extent that their sky is falling scenario would come to pass. That's been far from the case. In fact, the only sort of good, useful purpose that list has come to is, as I said, something we have called an armed prohibited purchasers database, which cross-checks people who've become prohibited from purchasing guns with those that have acquired guns in the past. And that's been a wonderful sort of experiment in California, because there was, I believe, about 20,000 people on that list, and now DOJ has the funding to go out and retrieve those guns. And so, when you talk about gun violence and who are the people most likely to commit acts of gun violence, it's oftentimes, unfortunately, those who've been convicted of felonies or domestic violence abuses, or who have been identified as having serious and dangerous mental illness. And now we can, in California, go and take guns from those people to make sure that they don't do harm. So, it's a tremendous asset to have the ability for law enforcement to figure out those individuals. And I believe it's probably saving a lot of lives in California.
I couldn't agree more. And I strongly think, I always ask the people I'm talking about on the other side, they always talk about it's the mental health issues. We have to do something about mental health. And that's a whole other discussion. But I say, what about the person who bought the gun and bought it? They were law abiding and they passed all of the scrutiny. And now they've had a breakdown and they're no longer mentally stable. How do we get their gun?
Right.
And on the federal level, we can't. But you say that you've come up with a system in California where you can, and I think that's fantastic. And of course it saves lives. Of course it does.
Yeah.
Well, Robin, I could talk with you forever. You're so knowledgeable. You're so articulate. The work the Law Center does, I know you support many of the cases. And once we have the proof, hard proof that carrying a gun does not provide self-defense, we're going to go after overturning some laws. So maybe you'll help us at that point. That's the whole point of doing the experiment. So just a joy having you on the show, and good luck with everything you're doing, and you still remain number one on my list of the organizations working in this area.
Well, thank you so much for having me on, Elliot, and thanks for the great work that you're doing to bring victims' voices to this issue and to highlight, I think, some of the really important truths that many of us already know. I really enjoy working with you.
My pleasure, too. Take care.
You too. Thanks so much.
Bye.
On the next episode of Recipes for Disaster.
So we've got our neighbor Paul coming over tonight for a barbecue, which is why I prepared a delicious lemon rosemary steak marinade from my special collection of old family recipes. To make sure the steaks are extra, extra, extra tender, I left them marinating out on the counter overnight, just like Nana used to.
Maria may mean well, but without food safety, it never ends well. Always thaw or marinate foods in the refrigerator at 40 degrees Fahrenheit or below, or you could make your friends and family really sick. Maria's neighbor Paul didn't think twice about the steak he ate until he was presenting his company's financial forecast to the board. That's when a sudden bout of food poisoning made it explicitly clear that profits weren't the only thing on the rise. Watch Recipes for Disaster at foodsafety.gov. You'll learn the right steps as Maria does everything wrong. Brought to you by the USDA, HHS, and the Ad Council.
Let me tell you who to blame. Blame the boy lying at your feet, his body oozing life through the hole in his stomach where the bullet tore him apart. Blame him for challenging you, for not looking away and for not backing down when you pulled out the gun. Blame your mother for bringing you into this world when she was but a kid herself and for dragging you up, not bringing you up. Blame society for not giving you hope. Blame your father for not being there, the man who looked after himself instead of looking after you. Blame the gun in your hand for making you a target, for making you more likely to be picked on. Blame the dead boy, blame your mother, blame society, blame your father, blame the gun, blame anyone but yourself for not being strong enough to put down the gun, to break the cycle.
Well, Martha, people ask us often, what do we do, National Gun Victims Action Council, that is different than what other people do? You know, are we a redundant force? And I'm sure you've heard that, right?
Well, yeah, I think that there's different groups that work against gun violence, and they all have a different, mission.
Exactly. uh, uh, so the thing that the way I always describe it is that we have an armed forces, and the armed forces, has different groups being part of it. There's an army, there's a navy, there's an air force, there's a Marines, and they all do different things. And we benefit because they all do different things. And that's how I describe the differences between our group, the groups working on our side. So what we do is we are focusing on economic levers. We don't interact with politicians. We're done asking. That's a big theme of ours. And our position is we want to tell the politicians what to do, and if they don't do them, we'll compel them. And I urge our listeners every show to go to our website, www.gunvictimsaction.org, and sign our Tell and Compel pledge. And tell me, what the pledge says is that when we call for an economic action, such as we did with Starbucks, that you won't go to Starbucks. That's all the pledge says, that you're going to pledge to support the economic actions we call for. Of course, the Starbucks thing ultimately worked out reasonably well, where they now don't welcome guns in their stores. Where before they permitted everyone to bring them in. They haven't quite banned them like they do in their corporate offices, but they've made it clear that guns are not welcome in their stores. And that's led to a number of other chains making the same determination, chains like Jack in the Box and Sonic, Chipotle. So Chili's, yeah. So that's what we're about. We're about using economic levers.
Well,
Excuse me.
And I could add something else to Elliot that differentiates us. If I'm not interrupting you, is that there's some wonderful, wonderful groups out there. Some are localized. You have, of course, the former mayors against illegal guns. You have the former Moms Demand. But what we are is the largest victims group in the nation. And also, I think we may be the only anti-gun violence group that is very connected with clergy. And those are two important distinctions.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, Martha. That's exactly the case. In fact, that's going to become clear in a moment about how close we are with clergy. And we are the largest victims group. We are. And I wish there weren't so many victims, but it's not only the victims, it's all the implications, of what the victims are. So, when there's one assault or there's one gun homicide, it affects 5 to 7 people for the rest of their lives. And that's what we are. Those are the victims. That's what we call the victims. And I'm one of them. After my son was murdered, I was told I was a victim, and at first I said, no, my son's the victim, but they explained, why that term was used. So yes, I'm glad you've made that distinction. Let's talk about Hallmark, because last week we called a boycott of Hallmark, and I'd like to give the background of it. And the we is National Gun Victims Action Council, working in partnership with the Newtown victims and clergy for corporate responsibility. So there you go, victims and clergy. And we had written a letter to Hallmark's chairman and to every member of the board, asking them to change their gun policy, but more importantly, or equally important, to become an advocate, to publicly come out for universal background checks, which 90% of Americans want. Polls continually show that. To publicly come out for universal background checks and to work for them, to advocate for them, to use their TV channel, for example, to talk about it, have public service announcements, to use their tremendous reach to get into the fight for universal background checks. So the letter said that essentially we were perplexed. We didn't get it. They're such a good company. If you go to their website and read about them, they talk about how they deal with integrity and honesty, and they care about the communities they serve, and they contribute to the communities they serve. And it's true, they do. They do a lot of good things in the communities they serve. And yet, they ban guns in their corporate headquarters to protect their CEO and senior management, so no one can bring a gun there. But in their 2,400 Hallmark Gold Crown stores, guns, they don't require those stores, which are independently owned, they don't require those stores to ban guns. And equally disturbing is they don't even have them put up a sign, or at least require them to put up a sign saying these are stores where guns are welcome. In other words, that this is not a gun-free zone, or
right.
Guns are welcome. So what do you make of that, Martha?
Well, no, you're right. It's the peak of hypocrisy and irony. And didn't you get a quote when, I guess they refused to meet with you and the clergy, but didn't you receive a quote about they don't want to be involved in divisive issues or something like that?
That was what happened. We gave them a week to respond to this letter, which was signed by maybe 20 or 30 faith groups in and around Newtown. It was signed by Newtown victims, by survivors, by first responders, by activists. And it was a graceful letter saying, we want to meet with you because we want to understand, and
right.
we'd like you to understand where
right.
we're coming from.
Right.
So when they called me, I was the point person for this. When they called me, the message was that the chairman says that we, Hallmark, do not get involved in divisive issues. And I said to the person I was speaking to, I think he was the head of public communications or something like that. I said, well, you don't have a choice here. We're involving you. This is not a question of whether you want to or not. We're involving you. And your choice is a business decision. You can be a hero to 90% of the American public that wants sane gun laws. Or you can rebuke them. You can rebuff them. You can say, we don't get involved. And if you think that telling people that you don't get involved is going to satisfy them, I don't think so, but that's your choice. So he said, well, let me go back and talk to the chairman. So he did. And the chairman's message to me the second time we talked was he won't meet with me or any of our group, and further that they don't get involved in divisive issues. And I said, this is the typical corporate sleight of hand. The facts are that you have 8 lobbyists that you pay over $500,000 a year to, and you get involved in issues regarding tax rates and telephone rates and TV and radio regulations, where you're advocating, and there are people on the other side who completely disagree with what you want. So you do get involved in divisive issues. Secondly, I said, that even if Hallmark's chairman loves guns and thinks guns are wonderful and detests our organization or organizations like us, this is such a clear business decision. You can be a hero to 90% of America, who are your customers, by the way. These are the very same people you sell to. Or you can be, rebuking them, just telling them, no, I'm not interested in what you want. And I said, it's such an incredibly poor decision that they're going to write this up in the business schools because we're not going to let go. We've called for the boycott. Yes, Martha, sorry.
I was just going to remark that maybe 40 years ago or even more, there was a similar phenomenon with the mafia. And the idea was if a business, and especially mom-and-pop businesses, didn't accept extortion, if something bad would happen to them, so they're not going to go up against the mafia or the mob. And that's what divisive means. It's cloaked language, but it means that we don't want that backlash, that black hand of the gun lobby. And yet, you can see that Chipotle and Chili's and some of the other, and Starbucks have only succeeded with this stance because, as you say, it's 90% of the nation. And they're courageous in standing up to what is essentially extortion.
Well, it is extortion, and they're not fully courageous because they aren't banning guns in their locations as they do in their corporate headquarters, the ones you've mentioned, Chili's, Starbucks,
Right.
Chipotle. They don't say in their corporate headquarters guns are not welcome.
Right.
We
Good
prefer
point.
you don't
Good
bring
point.
them. They're banned. Why?
Right.
Oh, maybe they're dangerous, but they don't do that in their stores. So that leads to the second part of the Hallmark initiative is we are going to stay on Hallmark's back until they do the right thing and come out for universal background checks and work for them. We urge people not to buy any of their products. We urge people not to support their sponsors, the sponsors that sponsor their Hallmark TV show. And we'll be talking a lot more about that in other releases we'll be sending out and in other public relations campaigns we'll be doing. We have Father's Day cards on our website. Father's Day is past, but as a belated one, you could still send one. They're free, or you can send them electronically. And they highlight the fact that each year, guns kill 5,000 fathers. 5,000 fathers are homicide victims each year. We have graduation cards. And the graduation cards are very poignant because they remind people how many students are not graduating because they're not alive. They were killed by guns. So, and we'll be having other cards in the future. And again, the cards are free. They're gun themed, for sane gun laws, but they are ones you can download or you can, just send electronically. And they're on our website, www.gunvictimsaction.org. So the point is that we have thrown down the glove here. One of the biggest mistakes our side has made in the fight for sane gun laws, Martha, and you and I have talked about it, is we've let corporations stand on the sidelines. And
you're absolutely right. You're right, and that enables the lawmakers to stand on to not represent their people because they're not getting any pressure from the corporations in their states.
Exactly. And as we've said, if corporate America wanted sane gun laws, we'd have had them yesterday. The moment corporations want sane gun laws, we'll have them. And I use as a parallel what happened with the marriage equality. And the gay and lesbian marriage equality issue, which is something they fought for many years and made incremental progress, but it was a tough uphill fight. And then in January of 2012, Microsoft came out and said that they support marriage equality, and that they were supporting an amendment in the state of Washington, where they're located, to grant marriage equality. And within 4 months, there were 239 major corporations, corporations like Apple and Google and General Electric and Oracle, et cetera, that came out supporting marriage equality. And within a little over a year, we've got it. We virtually have it.
You're absolutely right, Elliot. The corporate sector leads the legislative sector. Another example that goes back about 10 years was, these eggs that are made in such cruel conditions. Well, Google and AOL and other big companies said they were going to refuse to buy them, and then suddenly you saw laws. So it's the exact same thing. It makes you wonder why we have spent so long saying please to lawmakers standing in the rain with a candle, because they don't even hear it. They only respond to pain, economic pain. And another interesting economic action that was successful was, I think it was about 3 years ago, Arizona had passed a kind of a stop and show your green card law, a kind of profiling anti-immigration law that most of the country felt was just unnecessarily,
cruel.
Right.
Let's call it what it is.
Right. It was profiling, a driver or a pedestrian, but many people chose to not vacation in Florida, and of course, in Arizona, which of course is a big vacation state, with the weather and the Grand Canyon. And that was felt. It was really felt. Millions and millions were lost by Arizona.
Well, same thing, has been seen over and over, whether it's civil rights, whether it's any major issue. If corporate America wants it, it'll happen. I'm sad that the country works that way. It affects democracy and the democratic nation we're supposed to live under. But the reality, you have to deal with practical realities. And the reality is that if corporate America comes out for sane gun laws, we will have them. So Hallmark is the first company we're going after. And I didn't give the biggest reason. I said the reason we've identified them involve two issues. One, they ban guns in their corporate headquarters, but they allow them in their Hallmark Crown stores. And not only do they not insist or require that the stores be gun-free, but they don't even post a warning to customers. Right. That to me it's like you have a car and somebody with bad brakes and somebody wants to borrow it and you say sure, and you don't tell them that the brakes don't work.
Right, it's negligence. It's negligence legally.
It's negligence to the nth degree. The other thing is that Hallmark's public relations lady, their public communications woman, made a statement about a year ago that Hallmark would never support any anti-gun regulation. I'm going to say it again. Hallmark will never support any anti-gun regulation. This was to assure the gun industry that they weren't enemies, that they were, friends of the gun industry. Well, what they're really saying is that they are supporting the NRA's agenda, which is a lethal agenda. So Hallmark is saying that they don't support any background checks because the NRA, that's their position now, no background checks. Hallmark is saying it's fine if we have semi-automatic weapons It's fine if people carry them around openly. It's fine if we have magazines that shoot, 50 to 100 bullets at a time. Whatever the NRA wants, Hallmark is behind it. You don't get to be half pregnant. You're either pregnant or you're not. You don't get to be, you don't get to say, we're standing on the side. Yes, everyone wants universal background checks, but we don't get involved. No, when you say you don't want universal background checks or you don't want to get in divisive issues, what you're doing is you're enabling the NRA's gun agenda to go forward.
And we might add here, Elliot, that the reason that the Hallmark PR person made that remark was that Hallmark had mistakenly appeared on the NRA's enemies list, and the NRA maintains an enemies list that really, when you see it or you hear about it, it almost sounds like a satire, something from The Onion, but it's actually really true that they collect, like, on their enemies list are teachers, doctors. We should do a show on that because it almost is hard to believe that they could call, public servants and, little old ladies and, medical professionals. But that was how the Hallmark remark came about, was because they had been listed as an enemy of NRA, whereupon the PR person said, "Oh, no, we love you guys. We'd never, violate your gun rights by saying gun laws." And we're okay.
Sorry.
We're okay with people coming in our stores. Not even with a sign posted that, hey, somebody could be carrying next to you. But I just think the NRA enemies aspect to this is important.
I think you're right, and the reason what the NRA did was they published an earlier version. It was about 5 years earlier that they had this enemies list, which has corporations. It has any entity or individual that has spoken out for sane gun laws. So they have celebrities there, they have major corporations, they have organizations, you name it. And Hallmark was on because in the 90s rather, their then chairman, the father of the current chairman, did this outrageous thing. I mean, it's unbelievably outrageous when you think about it. Missouri was trying to pass a law that required people to get a permit to conceal and carry, and he contributed 20 grand. He thought that was a reasonable thing, that people who conceal and carry should have to get a permit. Well, that made him an enemy. So when they published that old list and Hallmark saw their name on it, they immediately went into action to get off and to make clear that we would never support any anti-gun regulation. Well, guess what, Hallmark? You're going to. We don't call them anti-gun regulations. We call them pro-public safety regulations. And if you don't want to live up to your stated vision, your stated goals, your integrity, you say you care about families and children, here's the number 2 killer of children, firearms. And many of the killers are people who would not pass background checks. They've illegally gotten their guns because 40% of the guns that are sold don't go through background checks. That's what universal background checks are. It's to cover the guns sold at gun shows or the guns sold over the internet. So somebody who couldn't pass a background check at a gun dealer can just go to a gun show or on the internet and get the gun that they couldn't get from the dealer. So universal background checks would require every sale to go through a background check. And Hallmark doesn't want to support that. They want to stand on the sidelines. Well, maybe they're right. Maybe the American people will say, it's okay, Hallmark, you can do that. But I don't think so. I know the victims and the millions of clergy that belong, to the organizations we're working with, and will be, expressing their opinions to the sponsors and to Hallmark, are, not going to accept that, and even, I mean, how could you in good conscience claim all the things Hallmark claims and then just say we're going to stand on the sidelines? Imagine this was drunk driving, and Hallmark was asked to participate, and advocate for safe driving laws, safe drunk driving laws, and they said, no, we don't get involved in divisive issues. Imagine if they did that. Well, that's, of course, they didn't do that because there wasn't a group saying that we have a right to drive drunk.
Good point, right. And if you don't, and our right to drive drunk is in the Constitution, and if you don't support it, we'll make sure that you're not reelected. You're right, so it didn't have that backlash. Elliot, can you speak a little bit more about the Newtown aspect to this Hallmark action?
Yes, I can. The Newtown reality is that everybody now knows that everyone in America is at risk. It doesn't matter what neighborhood you live in, where you are. The NRA's agenda is that, in fact, we live in a society where everyone carries a gun at all times in any place they want and can carry any kind of gun they want. That's the society they want. We did that once, if you remember Dodge City, and they wound up having to cut Dodge City in half. Well, one side you could carry guns and one side nobody could have a gun. But the people on this side are driven by sales. They have, facts and history mean nothing to them. I'm talking about the gun extremists, of course, which is about a quarter of the NRA membership, about 1 million people, and of course the NRA board. So the people in Newtown want to prevent in every possible way other towns, families, citizens from suffering what they've suffered. And besides the moral, ethical precepts and calls by religious people of faith, that's what faith is based about, recognizing the dignity of human life and the unique and special thing human life is, and then having the victims of Newtown who have experienced the horror of something they will never get past. I've never gotten past it, and I won't ever, nor do I want to. I don't want to forget my son, and the people in Newtown don't want to forget their children or their neighbors' children, and they're just dedicated to get us sane gun laws, and they're going to do what it takes. We're going to have a tidal wave of people demanding, and pushing for sane gun laws. And
Elliot,
we're going to get corporate America off the sidelines.
When you think about what happened to your son who was simply eating dinner in a restaurant in San Diego, or you think of the parents of kids who simply sent their kids to school, if those would have been like a tornado or a hurricane or something like that, then you say, oh, well, life is so sad and full of suffering. Those were completely preventable events that were courtesy of the gun lobby. And I think people need to remember that, because the gun lobby likes to pretend that these things just happen. They don't just happen. And we've talked so often about other countries where they don't happen.
You're absolutely right, Martha. We can't forget. And to know that these things are preventable, and for the chairman of Hallmark to say we are not going to get involved in divisive issues as though that's an acceptable response, we're not going to let it stand. It's as simple as that. We're not going to let it stand. We are going after corporate America, and we're going to get them off the sidelines. Hallmark is the first. Our goal is to develop a leadership council of leading corporations to advocate and make sure that we get sane gun laws. And big as the NRA is, corporate America is a lot bigger. So
Well,
if the politicians
you're right.
have to be made afraid of their votes, corporate America is the one they're going to be made afraid of. But once
Elliot, can
corporate
you talk a
America is
little?
in the game, we'll get sane gun laws, and we'll get them quickly. And
Can you
quickly is an
explain?
important thing. The
Can you
cost of
explain
delay
quickly?
is 30,000 lives a year lost to guns. And that's a cost we can't let drag out, for year after year.
Elliot, can you explain just briefly how the Century Council worked? Because I think a lot of people don't remember it or never really watched it, but that's such a model of the corporate responsibility.
Oh, very, very well, Martha. Yes. Most people identify MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, is the reason we have the laws we have that have, prevent or, work against drunk drivers. But the distillers, the leading distillers, the manufacturers, if you will, got together and said, look, we want to sell as much alcohol as we can, but the last thing we want to do is have children killing themselves and people, killing themselves or other people with drunk driving. So they got together, a bunch of them. They formed a group called the Century Council. They chipped in $175 million. They developed the breathalyzer, the thing we always see on TV of the drunk driver having to take a breathalyzer test. And they played a major, major role, along with MAD, to get the sane drunk driving laws passed that we did. And the effect has been to cut motor vehicle deaths from 30,000 a year down to 20,000 a year, and working to get it lower and lower. So the corporate America has to be a partner in this, and why wouldn't they be? Their people are the people getting killed. The gun lobby wants people bringing guns to work. Now they've gotten guns passed, so that laws passed, so in many states you can bring a loaded gun and keep it in your car in the company's parking lot, and the company can't stop you. So they've taken the company's right to decide what happens on their property away from them. But having to go out to the car, what if it's raining, and you want to go and shoot some people in your office? Why should you have to go outside to your car and get your gun? You should be able to have it right with you.
Well, these are bully tactics, and some companies have stood up to that, and I think it was the Florida Chamber of Commerce stood up to it because it is corporate America, and anybody who's worked at a business or had an administrative position knows you're not going to terminate an employee or fire him or something if he's got a gun in his car, and then all these workplace shootings. I mean, this is, again, driven by these lawmakers who are toadies to the gun lobby. It's not an expression of the 90% of this nation that is sick of what goes on at schools and work and just the Dodge City phenomenon.
It's absolutely the case. It's absolutely the case. And we can't allow it. Martha, you know that this is something we talk about every day, and I could talk about this with you for months at a time because it is so outrageous, and we have the power to stop it. We still have left the American people the one weapon that can't be taken away, that corporate America needs, which is our buying power. And if we use our buying power in an appropriate way, we will get the things passed, the laws passed that we need. So I urge everybody to stop doing business with Hallmark. Number one. Number two, to come to our website and sign our Tell and Compel pledge so we can build a critical mass of people who can then tell the politicians what to do and force them to do it if they don't do it. Well, we've talked so long. We've had such a wonderful visit with Robin Thomas, the executive director of the Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence. Martha, we've talked at length about the Hallmark Initiative, covered some of the news, and we've talked so much that I don't have time to to give my usual close here. But we actually discussed what I wanted to close with was the insanity of not being able to do research, and a representative calling research the propaganda arm for the president, the gun-grabbing president. That's what research is. Well, right. That's not what research is, but it's, we talked about it, so I guess that we've covered what I was going to do in my close. Well, thanks for listening to this week's episode of It's the Gun Stupid, brought to you by National Gun Victims Action Council on the We Act Radio Network. Remember to look for the playlist of highlights of all our episodes on youtube.com, We Act Radio DC, or on our website, gunvictimsaction.org. And check out our podcast, because you now can listen to our show anytime, any place, anywhere. Again, thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk with you soon. Take care.